Talk, a Google Plus and YouTube show designed to bring interesting and innovative therapists and those interested in psychotherapy or counseling together to share their work, their thoughts and ideas with each other. Hi, I'm Neil Brown, a psychotherapist with over 30 years of experience and deeply steeped in the theory and practice of family therapy. Now, after experiencing success in my career, my desire is to share the wealth of knowledge I've been given with others and to help other innovative professionals share their knowledge and gifts as well. That way we form a community and learn, grow, engage, and share together. I'm thrilled today to present to you Dr. Lara Honos-Webb. Lara is a clinical psychologist and a national expert in the fields of ADHD and depression. She is the author of several books, including The Gift of ADHD, The Gift of ADHD Activity Book, The Gift of Adult ADD, The ADHD Workbook for Teens, and Listening to Depression, How Understanding Your Pain Can Heal Your Life. Also with us today is Robin Holland. Robin is our director and will help facilitate today and bring us your comments and questions. So I would like to say, welcome, Laura. How are you today?
Great. Thank you, Neil. I'm so excited to be here.
Okay. And I'm broadcasting here from Santa Cruz, California, and where it is typically foggy in the morning. It'll clear and get a little warmer in the afternoon. How about you? Where are you today?
I'm in San Francisco. I'm actually in Walnut Creek, which is east of San Francisco.
Okay. Is it already sunny over there? Is the fog already lifted?
There's no fog in Walnut Creek. It's a valley, so it's always hot here.
Okay. So, Laura, I'm thrilled to have you. Tell me, you've been involved in the field of ADHD for a very long time, and please tell me, what brought you to that field? Where did the interest grab you? How did you get there?
Well, when I was a graduate student, I was both teaching undergraduate classes, and I was also working in the consulting room and as doing my kind of internships and placements. And I realized that ADHD looked really different in the classroom than it did in the consulting room. And I actually found that I enjoyed the ADHD students more than the straight A students because they were the ones that I was actually learning from, because they were so much more interested in solving problems or raising questions that I didn't have the answers to, or actually making up their own breakthrough ideas, but they really weren't interested in mastering the right answers that were at the back of the book. And so I started to see that there were these gifts that really came along with ADHD that were more appropriate at the college level, where they really should be learning how to think for themselves and be creative.
Oh, fascinating. And so how many years ago was that?
Oh my gosh, 15, 20, a long time ago.
So this is something that you've been interested in and studying for 15 or 20 years.
Yes, yeah. In fact, it was one of my ADHD students that was in an undergraduate class who, was getting all C's in my class, and not really doing well on the tests, but he wanted to do some research on ADHD, and we started to formulate this gift theory, and that it was a gift, and so we did some interviews with some of the people with ADHD, and we kept hearing over and over that they often felt that they had advantages over other people, and those advantages are exactly what I write about in the book. And what I observed myself, they were more creative, they were wanting to explore ideas and go into the unknown rather than just, figure out what the right answers that other people had already figured out. So it was really a different kind of cognitive style. It was also just a different way of being in the world in some ways. They were also more emotionally sensitive. They felt that they had advantages that way. So it was really even a research project that came from someone that had ADHD that a lot of this evolved out of.
Oh, that's fascinating and,
yeah.
and a wonderful beginning to a fabulous career. So tell me now, before we go farther with it, let's talk about exactly what ADHD is. So if you go, if the doctor tells you or someone tells you you've got ADHD, what are they talking about? What is ADHD when someone says they've got ADHD?
Well, it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and I think of it as in three major clusters. Obviously, inattention, then hyperactivity, and then impulsivity are the main clusters. And so, this looks like the inability to follow through on directions, the inability to finish a project once you start it, the inability to listen. For the kids, they say climbing on chairs. And also, I think for, one of the symptoms is also, they call it as if driven by a motor. And that one I like the most because it conveys that it's not a willfulness, that often people say it's as if there's this motor that I can't control that drives me, and I wish I could make it slow down. And I like it because it's also a metaphor. So it's sort of some poetry in the middle of the Diagnostic and Statistic manual.
That's great. So let's talk about the Diagnostic and Statistical manual. So what what when you go to the doctor, or what happens when the teacher says your son has ADHD or your daughter has ADHD? What happens then?
Well, that's different for everyone. And the first thing that I want to say is that I have seen parents before they make the decision of what to do, in the middle of making the decision of what to do, and after they've made those decisions. And every parent struggles whether they decide to take medication or not to take medication. Every parent struggles. They feel guilty afterwards. I'm working with a family right now where the parents feel guilty that they made that decision 10 years ago. So typically what happens is there's a referral to a psychiatrist, and usually medication is prescribed, and the parents struggle a lot with that.
Okay. So what happens is there's a referral, and the referral doesn't happen because this kid is creative and has a gift. The referral happens because it's annoying. This motor is annoying someone, or their creativity is annoying someone.
Right. And so, you probably know from the conversations that we have, is I would really like to turn all of that around pretty dramatically. And what I mean by that is, when I was in graduate school, the prevalence rate of ADHD was 1%, and now for school children, it's 11%. And so I think that the overdiagnosis has gone so far that I really am recommending that families get 12 sessions of psychotherapy, or as your specialty, family therapy would be even better. Before
your statistic gives us a 1,000% increase, I think.
That's right. So I know your practice is already full, but there's a lot of new people coming out that need, and as we joked about before, I mean, let's say a family gets 12 sessions of family therapy. They're going to have positive side effects that last them for the rest of their life. They're going to learn about development. They're going to learn about the teen brain. They're going to learn how to communicate with each other. They're going to learn about emotional intelligence. They're going to learn stress management. And so I really see no downside to that. But on the other side, because we know that so many of these kids are being overdiagnosed, what's happening is they're getting a lifelong regimen of medication. And in some cases, that may be, a necessary thing, but we know that a lot of these cases are just straight out misdiagnosis. So I think that to weed out some of these, 12 sessions of therapy will a lot of times give some clues onto things that look like ADHD but are not ADHD, and then and then there'll be some treatments for those other problems.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the other things, Laura, that look like ADHD but are not?
Well, the number one thing right now is, of course, technology addiction. So if a kid has playing video games, they have an iPhone, there's an addiction to pornography among teenagers because it's just so easy to get to and it's free. And all of these things are incredibly, stimulating and distracting. So when we say attention deficit means I can't pay attention, it's because there's so many other things to pay attention to. One study found that for kids, they can only study for 3 to 5 minutes before they're looking at some kind of technology, whether it be their iPhone, their text messages, or a video game. I see about 8 hours of screen time among a lot of the people that I work with, and that could look like 5 hours of video games. And so, right, and I think back to when I grew up and there were 3 channels on a TV, and I really wasn't interested in most of what was on those 3 channels. Right. And now, these kids have, every video game, that's not even talking about the pornography, every kind of TV show, and every single minute on hundreds of channels, and it's incredibly distracting. I think that's one of the number one. Also, with all that screen time, people don't sleep, and we all know that lacking sleep is going to create a massive attention deficit. You know, I remember one time watching the news, and they said that it was against the Geneva Convention to deprive a prisoner of war of sleep because it was considered torture. Mm-hmm. And yet it's so common, the sleep deprivation in our culture, whether it's because of screen time or because of the massive loads of homework, or whether it's because of all these other things that are, you know, the pressure to perform. All of these things, there's a massive loss of sleep too.
So sleep deprivation. And then you gave me an interesting statistic as we were preparing for our show today about about a family condition that relates to ADHD in kids. Depression in the parent. Right,
and you know, another reason that that ADHD can be misdiagnosed is if you have a depressed parent, and there's a lot of research, a depressed parent can lead to problems in the children. And one study even found that if you're giving a kid ADHD medication, for those who have depressed parents, the medication seems to be less effective. Now that doesn't seem to make any sense, because biological treatment be less effective. And I think that it tells us a little bit about the devastating impact on a family when a parent is depressed. And so let's just say we're not even now, that's just one study that that's out there. We're not even talking about parents who might be drug addicts or alcoholics or have a lot of other things going on in addition to depression. Mm-hmm. So, it is so important, to when a kid comes in and he has some of the symptoms of ADHD some of the time, without looking at the whole system, is really a mistake.
Okay, so stressful family conditions of any form can create a set of behaviors that look like ADHD.
Absolutely. One of the things that's very frustrating is a family will go through a divorce, and within 6 months, they're thinking, oh, my child has ADHD, and they come in for an evaluation. And within 6 months, that child has gone from living in one home to living in 2 different homes to navigating a divorce in the family. And to me, as a psychiatrist, sometimes you may just use a checklist and see all these symptoms and say, oh, yeah, that's ADHD. But hopefully, as a psychologist, we're really trained to look at the context and can say, you really need to navigate this dramatic change in the family before we can know what's causing the attention problems.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that psychologists do that. I thought that was the world of social workers, but now I'm glad to see that we have our affiliation there too. Mm-hmm. That's great. Robin, do we have any questions or comments coming in that we need to respond to at this point? I'm not getting anything from Robin, so we will go on. So, Lara, so now we've ruled out a lot of things. We've ruled out family stressors and other issues. So now let's just say that our youth, our child, is now diagnosed with ADHD. Mm-hmm. What the heck is that? I'm wondering if it's just a description of way a person really is, or is this some sort of biological abnormality, or is it a biological difference? Is it a neurological difference? What have we got?
I do think of it very much as a brain difference. And I do think of it as a brain difference that doesn't match very well with the current educational system. One way to think about it is there was some research suggesting that the genetic loading for ADHD maps onto nomadic tribes. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense. Tribes, when you think about the whole context of history, how long in history have people been sitting in a seat, for 50 minutes in a classroom where one person is talking at them? That throughout history, that hasn't really been the way the world has worked. And of course, there were nomadic tribes, there were farmers, there were hunters. And so for the nomadic tribes that would be, of course, moving all the time, you can imagine that there would be a completely different lifestyle, stimulation seeking. And so it's kind of almost humorous to think about, that of course all humans are different and, want to do different things. And it also reminds me of Michael Phelps, who was, of course, the, multi-gold medal Olympic champion swimmer. And he had been diagnosed with ADHD as a young child. And you can just picture, one of the greatest athletes in the world, what would that be like for him to sit in a classroom? Mm-hmm. And so that's a great place where there's this difference, which is probably genetic in some ways, which just does not match with the school system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to mute and... Okay. Okay, so I misunderstood an instruction I got. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can just look at it as differences, but now we're still going to consider medication. Is that right? We're still going to consider medication for some of these kids and teens?
Yeah, I don't say that ADHD is not a disorder. And the reason is because I see the suffering every day. And so, kind of going back to abnormal psychology, what does psychopathology mean? It means that there's suffering. It means that a person is not, doing well. And so when you see kids that are failing in the school system, and then the consequences of that are that they, have low self-esteem, they begin to have a lot of anxiety and depression. So it really does become a bigger and bigger problem. And so then what the answer is of course a different question. But it gives you a sense that there is a deficit disorder to it, at least in the way it interacts with the world.
Yeah, I think we should speak to that, because I think if a kid has this difference, then that it causes them to underachieve or achieve according to the standards of the classroom at a much lower level. That can affect their self-esteem, that can get their parents frustrated with them. Very often it's called just doesn't pay attention, just doesn't try, daydreams, is unmotivated. And so at some point they develop a negative identity, or more commonly called low self-esteem. And then now we have a kid who is truly unmotivated because they feel like trying is a futile effort, and they're constantly being told, if you just tried, you have all the potential, you're just not meeting up to your potential. And so they give up trying, because trying doesn't really get them any place in the context at which they're being expected to achieve. And then related to that, they can begin to act out, and then they come in with the acting out behavior. And sometimes a diagnosis of self-esteem is a few layers down before we can even get to it.
That's right. And if you look at what you described what's called learned helplessness. They try and they don't get the results that they want. Learned helplessness is a formula for depression. And so many times when you're treating ADHD and depression and anxiety. And then, of course, as they get older, that can turn into substance use, drug use, alcohol use.
Well, that's challenging and painful and almost overwhelming to think about, trying to get to all those things. So tell me about it. What do you do when someone comes into your office and you've got a couple of parents and an 11-year-old, and they're really frustrated with a kid who obviously has talents and skills and abilities, and is coming in with a lot of acting out behaviors, negative behaviors, and a lack of willingness to cooperate?
Usually the first thing I'll do is focus on the gifts, find the strengths, because in order to make the motivation for change, a person has to feel like they have some strength and competency to make those changes. And it's so fascinating how quickly people can find those gifts and talents, and how consistent they are in terms of, they're often very creative. I had one kid come in, and he was doing so terribly in school, and he showed me a video that he made, and I was almost crying. It was so beautiful. I mean, you're just like, wow, this kid could really be, a George Lucas or something. And and so people just have so many talents, and so there's a creativity. They're usually very empathy. I've had kids that were doing terribly in school, and they say, well, why aren't you paying attention in class? And they'll say, well, I was looking around, and I noticed one of the other students, and I seemed like they didn't feel like they mattered, and I really wanted them to know they mattered. And so you see these things where people are just paying attention to other things, which really brings us back. I mean, it's not that kids are not paying attention. They're just not paying attention to what they're supposed to be paying attention to. And that's how you can find the gifts, is you ask, well, what are you paying attention to? So for some of the kids, they, I was feeling so much anger when I thought about what happened at breakfast this morning, or what, I texted so-and-so and they didn't text me back. And so then what we have, that's emotional sensitivity. And then you can find for other people that, it's kind of like a Michael Phelps, where they just have so much exuberance and energy that they can't sit still. And then, some people are, there's a window in the classroom, they're staring out it and they're looking at the leaves falling from the trees or the squirrel running around, and they're really connected to nature, and that's more interesting to them. And these are all, I just walked through what I'm considering some of the gifts of ADHD. And so that's where I always start. And one thing I say to families is, and to kids, is getting good grades in school is telling you what a good person you are at studying. But that's not really how we always think of intelligence. And so, for example, people who are really good problem solvers, your grades aren't reflecting what a good problem solver you are, because usually the problem's already solved. You just have to know the answer and memorize it. And even on the other level, imagination, which you mentioned, we know that in the real world, here in Silicon Valley, imagination is the coin of the realm. That's what these major companies are paying thousands of dollars to bring people to come in and train people how to be innovative, train people how to have imagination.
So we have a question coming in from Sheila Hensley. Hi, Sheila. Thanks for your question, which is, what's the difference between ADD and ADHD? Would you clarify that, please?
Yeah, okay. So there actually is no diagnosis called ADD. It's called Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder Inattentive Subtype. So, of course, that's a lot to say, so people just say ADD. And what it means is you don't have the hyperactivity or the impulsivity, you just have the inattention, and it's a lot harder to diagnose, you can imagine.
Okay, because you don't have all those annoying behaviors.
Right, exactly.
Okay. All right. So, so a kid comes in and you found their strengths and you begin to work with those in the family, and lo and behold, the family starts feeling a little bit better about who their youth and child really is, and the kid begins to feel a little bit better about who he is. What about getting them so they actually can achieve better in school? We're reading these days, or hearing these days, an awful lot about brain plasticity. Can kids with ADHD relearn or teach their brain to function in a way that would make them more successful according to the expectations of your basic classroom?
Okay, so that's a good question, because the answer is yes with neuroplasticity, and that's part of the answer. But we have to remember that to change the brain, it takes a long time and a lot of repetitions. It's to have a person who has this more imaginative way of thinking and creative way of thinking to be sort of a fact finder or follow-through person. It takes a lot of time. And so I think the most quickest effective way is for the schools to begin to give accommodations. And so you're probably familiar with these. It can be more time on tests. It can be not getting points off if you hand in work late. But some of the most, the best ways of doing it is giving kids multiple ways to be evaluated. So instead of a multiple choice test, maybe they can, do a podcast, or maybe they can write a play, or maybe they can, write a paper if they choose, or something that is more along the lines of something they're already interested in, and that they can use their specialized interests. So that's going to be the quickest way to not have a devastating outcome, is to get in there and get some really creative and effective accommodations. And then you're right, you can teach executive functioning. So executive functioning means all the things we want a kid with ADHD to have, is to be able to be organized. So many times these kids could do the work, but they have no idea what their assignments are or when they're due. So you want to put in a lot of systems in place for organizing. You want to put in a lot of systems in place for starting.
I know exactly what you mean, but I'm betting that a lot of people don't know what that means. Putting a lot of systems in place for organizing. I mean, I'm sure that there are a lot of parents out there putting systems in place and the kids aren't using them. So what does it really mean, putting systems in place for kids to help them organize? What does that really mean?
Well, this is a place where technology can come in handy.
Oh.
So it can mean using technology to, for example, if the teacher, one of the places where kids forget is if it's, if a teacher writes something on the board and it's not on their assignment sheet, so they can take a picture of what's written on the board to remember it better. Oh. Or you have some daily or weekly notes going back and forth between the teacher and the student about what's missing and what's not, because typically an ADHD student will have no idea what's missing and what's not. So just putting some scaffolding, having some more supports there, whether it's technology or a kind of one-to-one back and forth with the teacher.
How about either tutoring or parental help at homework time? Sometimes parental help at homework time creates another level of family struggle. But is this providing false security, or is this actually help?
I think that the tutoring can be a good idea, and it can be an alternative, because then this would go along with what you're talking about, neuroplasticity, because what they'll be doing is they'll be getting more repetition, more scaffolding, and so will get better over time. One of the things that I say is one of the premises of neuroplasticity is the harder you try, the smarter you get. And this is probably the biggest message that we want to give ADHD kids, because what they have gotten is, why try? Because I have a deficit disorder, which points to some of the problems with the label itself. It's a self-defeating label, so they can come up with, well, why should I even try? When really the solution is to try harder. So I think that that's one phrase that I say to everyone that comes in my office is, the way to build your brain is to work harder. It's like building muscles. If you go to the gym and you lift weights, you get bigger muscles. If you work harder, you'll get better grades and get smarter.
Yeah, well, one of the guests that we've had on the show was John Fleming, an educational therapist, and he used to refer to educational therapy as coming to the brain gym.
That's nice, yeah.
It took a lot of the negative stigma off of it. So let me ask this.
A question. Can I pop in? I managed to unmute myself.
Oh, great, Robin. Nice to see you. What's up?
Yeah, thank you. When you say work harder, what does work harder really mean for a person with their brain who has this kind of gifted brain, let's say?
Right. Thank you. Well, what's 50 to 75% of academic success is based on persistence and motivation. And so what happens is the actual diagnosis of ADHD really makes less persistence and less motivation, because it's kind of like saying this is true for children and for adults. Well, why should I even try? Because I have this deficit disorder. And the thing is, and this is really the whole point of all of my work, is that I really want people to define themselves by what's working rather than what's not working. And that's why I don't really get in an argument with people about, are you trying to say it's not a disorder? No, I'm saying it's a gift and a disorder, but you can always choose to define yourself by what's working rather than what's not working. And that becomes very important in terms of motivation and persistence. So that's really where I'm going with that the harder you try, the more you build your brain.
Awesome. Thank you.
So another important question is, when parents are considering advice to medicate or not medicate, how do you help them make that decision?
Honestly, I just say to them, whatever you decide, you're going to struggle with now and for years to come, because every family I've worked with, has doubted that whatever they decide. People who decide not to medicate question themselves. People who decide to medicate question themselves. So what I say is, what's more important is that you focus on the gifts, because the gifts will build up the self-concept, the self-efficacy, which is the idea that I can be successful in this world, and which will help with the depression and the anxiety. So managing the gifts is what I really focusing on the gifts, because what will happen is then over a certain amount of time, you know, you're going to have another disorder to medicate and make a decision about. So I really, you know, that's a decision that's made between a psychiatrist and a family about whether they do or they don't take the medication.
Okay. Do you know of any long-term studies that talk about the implications, long-term implications of medication?
Yeah, actually right in Berkeley was one of the centers of what's called the MTA, which was a longitudinal study on the effects of medication. And this study confirmed exactly my experience, which is, you know, really, you know, quick out of the gate, maybe in the first year, you see some benefits to the medication. But those benefits, you know, over time, you know, I think by the 8th year follow-up, there was no difference between the people who had been on medication and those who had not been on medication. And so what I find in my practice is most often, really, what happens is I'm seeing families where they have been on medication for 5 to 8 years, and they're coming to me because they need a lot more than the medication. So that's why, you know, I don't really go out there in terms of, you know, anti-medication or pro-medication, but other than to say that the MTA study, you know, which was a lot of it was coming out of the UC Berkeley, showed that after 8 years, the statistical significance between the two conditions was not noticeable. But the other thing they said was that there was a need for treatments, psychosocial treatments, which is obviously, you know, kind of the conclusion that would come out of that. And that study would only use a behavioral intervention. And so, you know, what I'm offering here is something very different from a behavioral intervention. Of course, I use a lot of those same tools, but it's just not enough to treat ADHD, to just reward someone when they do what they're supposed to and punish them when they don't do what they're supposed to, because that's going to create a whole new set of problems.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it really is about dialing into those gifts and helping the kid and their family and their school embellish those and utilize those effectively.
Yeah, thank you. I like how you said that, dialing into the gifts. That's exactly a way to say it. Mm-hmm.
Right. Robin, do we have another question here? It's the print's small on my screen, so I can't read it.
Yeah, a comment from Sheila Hensley that just reiterating that it's more important to focus on the gift. Such a beautiful statement. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. And you know, it goes back to what I said earlier about what if we just, instead of diagnosing kids with ADHD the first time, we gave them 12 sessions of therapy before they ever got an evaluation. And similarly, because there's no negative side effects to family therapy, it's all good. What are the side effects of helping a person find their gifts, what they're naturally good at, what they're already interested in, and using that to build their motivation and persistence? Maybe we should just do that for every kid anyways, so there's really no side effects.
I see a line forming outside my door as we speak here.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine a better thing than that.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're all in agreement on that. Some people might fight us on it. So let's move the topic over to adult ADHD. There are more and more people coming in saying, oh, now that we've got this thing and my kid has it, I've figured out, I've got it, and it's really making it hard for me at work, and I'm supposed to be sitting there and I can hardly sit there, and maybe I've got it. My wife tells me, she gives me all my to-do list, and I get distracted and I'm off doing this or that. And now my life is just kind of struggling in ways that I think might even be treatable.
Right, and it's been a major shift because, you know, it was only the DSM-5 where adult ADHD was even included in the DSM. So again, it was considered a child disorder 20 years ago, and so recently it's an official diagnosis, but has been diagnosed a lot. And again, I think that adults have so many more options than kids. And so it's so much more promising because adults don't have to go to school every day.
Right.
And they can choose their environments, and hopefully what happens is that many adults find out that the real world doesn't at all operate like school, or it doesn't have to. So many of my adult ADD clients are really, really successful. And in my book, The Gift of Adult ADD, I profile 10 very successful people, and who are people who are not doing what they did in school. And I know one of them, Damon, who he was a person who was, worked in nature, and he felt so compelled to clean up the beaches, and he, works as a physical trainer, and he would really, it was important to him to, clean up the natural world. And of course, that's something that the world needs, and there's so many jobs now in that field that it's not, again, you don't have to sit behind a desk or in a cubicle or in front of a computer. And when adults figure that out, then they can lead a life where they're not impaired by this. And, one example out here in California, there's a lot of majors are in, tourism and recreation and the parks. And there's so many parks out here. There's Disneyland. There's so many ways to earn a living that don't involve sitting behind a computer all day.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Robin, did you have something to bring in at that point? I thought I saw you.
Yeah, we have a couple of more comments here. Roxanne Davenport had her child tested at the school to see what area that they needed more help with in class. So school is involved. And Dr. Sporty says, I am proud that you are all doing this video feed for many people, plus the valuable information provided. We must go beyond the thinking and feeling and take the action to be proactive change. And yes, hi, Dr. Lara. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so for adults, I think it's also important to notice that, the coaching can also be very effective in terms of, how do you manage that intent? How do you manage being distractible? And again, part of the answer is, finding out what your specialized interest is and following that, because, everyone, even the mainstream ADHD experts, will say that there is this other thing called hyper-focusing that goes along with ADHD. And it means when they have a special interest, you can't stop them from doing what they're doing. And so if a person can pursue that specialized interest in the real world, it will not look like they have ADHD. One of the other people I interviewed in the book was a fire chief. And so imagine that, he said, the greatest day of my life is standing on top of a roof when it's hailing, trying to put out a fire. Now, what kind of a person would think that was the greatest day of their life? I mean, obviously, it's a different kind of brain that would enjoy that so much. And it would be someone that was stimulation seeking. It would be someone that really needed a lot of, excitement going on. And he even said that, like, for a lot of people, that level of stimulation, it releases adrenaline, which is really, it's a stimulant, and that's what the medication is for ADHD. And so that in some ways they could think more clearly in an emergency than in just everyday life.
Yes, and it sounds like a lot of clients that I currently work with they call themselves adrenaline junkies. So.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way of thinking about it, and that there are jobs in the world that need people who seek stimulation in that way. Yeah.
Right. A lot of fires in California right now, and they're probably doubling the number of firefighters that we need and may continue to need if the West keeps heating up. Yeah.
It brings up such a good question, which is, what are we training our kids for, actually? We're not training them to think for themselves, because there's a right answer at the back of the book. We're not training them to be a creative thinker. I remember one of my clients telling me that they had to write a boring paper, and just to keep it interesting, they wrote a poem at the beginning of the paper, and they got points off for writing the poem. So, which suggests what? That, because they didn't follow directions. They didn't get credit for writing a poem, but they weren't following directions. So we have to say, are we training people for what the world really needs? Because so much is being automated. We need people who are imaginative, innovative, inventors, creative thinkers. That's what we need. We need people who have empathy. empathy isn't something that we can, automate. And if you think about our jobs, therapists, healing professions, the empathy is the #1, quality required in those jobs.
Right. Empathy and the ability to see things from a new and helpful perspective, which, if what you're telling me is an ADHD characteristic of out-of-the-box thinking and empathy. That explains why an ADHD adult like myself chose the profession of psychotherapy. By the way, that's self-diagnosis. I didn't know I had ADHD until ADHD became a thing and my clients were being diagnosed with it. So I decided, oh, I get it.
Yeah, well, I've always said, here you are doing a TV show, and it takes someone who has a lot of energy. It takes someone who has a lot of stimulation seeking to do that. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Well, we're moving towards the end of our show. We've got a few minutes left. I wonder if there are any subjects that we ought to have covered but haven't covered. Robin, is there anything that's coming up for folks?
People are recognizing effects of this in their worlds. Sheila recognizes that her mother probably had this and there wasn't help for her. And Roxanne says her husband is a pyromaniac and he didn't find out he had ADHD until he was in the Air Force. He's a volunteer fireman. So I think there's just kind of like a lot of resonance here with what you're talking about, and just not clinically naming it and then having that be the demise, but seeing what it means and what the impact of that can be in a positive way.
And maybe, right now we're talking about ADHD, but maybe the bigger subject is we need to get out of the good kids, bad kids way of thinking about our kids today and start thinking about differences among kids and how to value and find the strengths in all the kids in our classrooms, which is what's going to make them motivate and feel important and feel valued and feel connected to their school environment, is if who they are is seen as gifted and important in some way.
Right. Yeah, and this is really the point that I think is underlying all of this. Is when we treat people, we realize every single human being has a profile of strengths and weaknesses. We're all good at some things. We're all bad at some things. We have, even our intelligence. We're, good in some areas. The IQ test has, many different subtests, 12 or 14, and everyone does good on some and bad on others. Our personalities, we have good and bad, and really to be effective, to have self-efficacy, to feel that you can be successful in the world, you need to choose to define yourself by your strengths and not your weaknesses. Now, of course, we do have to go back and clean up our weaknesses and patch those up, but the reality is we can't do that if we're depressed and anxious. So first step, we have to define ourselves by what's already working. And really, that's the only position from which you can make those changes. And really, I hope that your experience is similar, but people's lives reflect their self-concept. And by self-concept, I mean what they believe they're capable of achieving.
Yes.
And so that's really different. I'm not talking about narcissism. We all, have kind of shiver when we hear that word, but it means what a person feels they're entitled to. And that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what a person believes in their guts that they are capable of achieving. And their life is going to reflect that so precisely. And so really, I get emails from people saying, if you knew my husband, you would never write The Gift of ADHD. And even more sad, I hear people saying, if you knew my child, you could have never written that book. And what do you think the impact of that is? So really, we can be the operators of our own brains.
Right.
And
I'm just saying, that's where, in my experience, when parents come in and we'll talk about that, what's happened is that they've gone on a journey of a control battle where the worse it gets, the worse it gets. So as the kid acts out, the parents name, label, and shame, and as the parents label and shame, the kid acts out, and then it becomes a dynamic process that creates itself independently of who that youth or child really is and who those parents really are and they get the worst out of each other instead of the best out of each other.
Absolutely, Neil, and I know that's your area of treatment and expertise and a book that you're, coming out with. So, that goes back to my original recommendation. Maybe before anyone gets an evaluation for ADHD, they should get some therapy first. And, again, no one will be hurt by that, and everyone would benefit from it.
Okay. Well, on a very hopeful note of what we really want is to be a strength-based society and to realize that we need a multiplicity of strengths and personalities to be a successful society and to be happy and successful and productive individuals. I think that's a great place for to stop our broadcast for today. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching, and we'll look forward to further shows in the future. Lara, thank you so much for being on the show. You're a wealth of information, and I just really have benefited from it, and I know everyone else has too.
Great talking to you guys.
Okay. Bye.